The earth still remembers where she laid them. A narrow patch of soil near the edge of a crumbling orchard where the ground never settled, no matter how many seasons passed. Locals spoke in low whispers about the orchard, how even the birds refused to perch on its branches, how the wind carried a faint wail whenever it passed through the empty limbs. They said the cries belonged to children, children who never had the chance to grow, buried alive by the one person meant to protect them, their mother. In the year 1869, in a quiet rural settlement far from the civilized reach of the city, a woman stood before the town claiming she was not a monster but a scientist, that her actions were not murder but progress, that by burying her children, she was proving a theory the world had not yet understood. Before we continue with the chilling story of the mother who buried her children alive and called it science, make sure to subscribe to the channel. More stories like this wait in the shadows, and you won't want to miss them. In the late 1860s, the nation staggered beneath the weight of the war's aftermath. Across the fields and towns of America, prosperity came slowly, creeping into the lives of farmers and merchants with the heaviness of a forgotten debt. Old soldiers limped through villages where barns stood half-roofed and the once fertile fields had grown stubborn with weeds. Yet new ideas also traveled quickly, never faster than the whispers of science, a force wielded both with reverence and suspicion. It was in this uneasy balance between progress and ignorance where she lived, an ordinary woman by outward appearance with nothing in her stern features to betray the ink-black edges of her mind. Her name was whispered by neighbors in tones soaked with dread, but at first she was spoken of with respect. A mother of 5, a widow by misfortune, she was considered educated beyond her peers. While others clung to the safety of scripture alone, she devoured pamphlets of medicine and science that trickled in from cities like Boston and Philadelphia. She copied crude diagrams of the human body into her notebooks, and often spoke of the higher mysteries. Mysteries her neighbors did not dare question. The settlement, where she made her home, was a modest one. Nothing more than a scattered collection of timber houses, a schoolhouse too small to keep the winter wind at bay, and a church that smelled more of damp earth than incense. Women in these places were meant to be keepers of kitchens and cradles. She, however, carried herself differently. Her words had an edge of conviction, her gaze fixed not on the simple, daily labors of the field or loom, but on deeper pursuits. Children surrounded her, her own flesh and blood, bright-eyed, restless, always hungry for the touch of their mother's hand or the warmth of her approval. She gave it rarely, choosing instead to lecture on science, on questions beyond their years. To neighbors, she was peculiar, yes, perhaps eccentric, but not dangerous. Not yet. A shift began when her reading turned to the stranger theories making their way through half-forgotten journals and wandering lecturers. Ideas that mortality itself could be defeated, that matter, once buried, might yet stir with force. Scientific progress was veiled in mystery, and men boasting of discoveries found no shortage of believers, and she was listening. These theories entered her home like unwelcome guests, threading themselves into her thoughts and twisting her duty as a mother into something darker. She spoke of experiments, not prayers. When a neighbor's child fell ill with a fever, she dismissed prayer and called instead for tests of air and water. When livestock perished suddenly in the bitter cold of January, she remarked not on God's hand, but on the possibilities of altering survival through what she called living trials. Slowly, she gathered in her notebooks a conviction, a belief that the boundaries of life and death could be transgressed by those bold enough to face horror unflinching. It was her own children she studied most. The boys, with their fragile limbs and appetite for play, became subjects in her ledgers. The girls, with curls falling across their small brows, were measured and weighed, examined as though they were specimens and not daughters. By the spring of 1869, the air in the small settlement had grown uneasy. Whispers often followed her down the dirt lanes. She had been seen more than once lying in the grass of the orchard after dusk, her hands spread wide upon the soil, listening, she claimed, to the very earth for its secrets. Some grew fearful, others dismissive. An eccentric widow, they said. Harmless, though strange. But there was something in her gaze when she lectured in that soft, steady voice, not harmlessness, but determination. On an April afternoon, when frost still veined the windows of unheated rooms, her older son vanished. The neighbors were told the boy had taken ill and died suddenly of fever. The ground, still half frozen, was cut open for a grave, and what remained of him was lowered carefully beneath the soil. The town's preacher pronounced warnings of providence, the neighbors muttered condolences, and the family returned to their lives with muted sorrow. But there was no grave marker, and her eyes, red from feigned tears, betrayed neither grief nor relief, but something colder. Her second child followed within weeks. Another fever, another hasty burial. Mothers held their children tighter, and men began to question aloud the health of the widow's household. Yet still, nothing could be proven. Illness was common, death a familiar visitor. Suspicion alone could not uproot her, and so life continued, though under an uneasy veil. It was not until the third grave was dug, shallow, concealed beneath the orchard where no minister had blessed the soil, that villagers whispered of wickedness. Children are not meant to vanish in neat succession. No pestilence had gripped the town. No other home had lost so much breath and laughter in such a short time. But she explained herself with calm precision to those who questioned. She spoke not of wickedness but of science. She claimed her children represented a living proof that by burying them, she would observe if life might return, if the breath might be called back, not by the Lord's hand, but by human will. The words fell upon ears unready for them, but her certainty carried weight. And so her neighbors, trembling, wished to believe it mere madness, a temporary illness of the mind brought upon by grief. Yet others secretly were drawn. The prospect that a man or woman might reach across the veil of death with bare hands and summon life was too intoxicating to dismiss entirely. She prepared herself meticulously for each act. The ground chosen was not near the churchyard or family plot, but beneath the shadow of fruit trees bent low with spring bloom, a place where the soil was soft enough to cradle small bodies. She marked each mound carefully in her journal, measuring the depth, noting the condition, and recording in precise detail the effect on the child's body as the soil swallowed breath and heartbeat. Her logic moved in circles only she could complete. She was not destroying life, she insisted. She was only testing its edge, discovering whether it could be restored. She quoted discoveries of men she had never met, inventors who claimed to capture lightning, doctors who whispered of galvanism, electric charges coaxing motion from the dead. Others had experimented upon corpses. Why should she not, a mother of limited means, experiment upon what was hers by both blood and authority? The sickened logic held, enough to see her through the nights of muffled cries echoing in her ears long past silence. She told herself that each sound was data, each hand clawing for air, nothing more than trials proving the law. Humanity would benefit, she believed. Sacrifices were necessary for science to advance, and if the world condemned her as a monster, she embraced rather the title of pioneer. Years later, scholars and chroniclers would argue endlessly the cause, whether grief-stricken madness, or a hidden cruelty, or a faith so distorted that even atrocity seemed divine. But for the men and women who lived beside her, it was only horror. The empty spaces where children's voices should have echoed haunted the village as heavily as any ghost. And still she moved as though untouched, purchasing flour, tending gardens, nodding to neighbors who crossed themselves when she passed. Each burial filled her journals with new proofs, new theories. In her mind, she was building a science that the rest of the world dared not yet understand. By midsummer, the count of graves beneath the orchard stood at 4. Yet her voice carried more than shame. She spoke without apology. She told others she had glimpsed something within the soil, that beneath the weight of earth a spark lingered, that children buried with intent, with observation, with precise conditions of soil and air, might yield proof that the line between life and death is not so absolute. It was, she told herself as the 5th child gasped beneath her hand, not murder. It was progress, yet whispers began to spread. And eyes, now suspicious, watched closely. The orchard where the soil shifted and heaved carried more than a stench of rot. It had a story waiting to be uncovered. The orchard grew strangely quiet that summer. Farmers noticed that the trees nearest the graves bore no fruit. Their blossoms withered before their time, as if touched by frost, although no frost had fallen. Where laughter once rang through those branches, there was only silence and the hushed stir of unsteady wind. Neighbors spoke less openly in her presence, yet behind their closed doors, the story of the widow-turned experimenter was told again and again, each version darker than the last. Some claimed to have seen shadows moving at night beyond the borders of the orchard, small shapes barely outlined against moonlight, like children wandering toward home only to dissolve back into soil before dawn. Rumors hardened into suspicion after the fifth burial. No illness swept through the town. No other family mourned. Yet 5 of her children had passed away in fewer months than the seasons required to change. Those who had once given comfort now gave distance, crossing the dirt road before approaching her small wooden home, their eyes fixed on the dust beneath their boots rather than the figure who might greet them. Still, she did not waver. In her journals, she wrote as physicians did, in neat lines of observation and conclusion: day of burial, condition of soil, depth of grave, duration of muffled cries before silence, and afterwards the stillness that carried within her ears like a hymn. When she looked upon her hands, she chose to see not the stains of betrayal but the steady ink of reason. In her mind, these children had been spared a common fate. Disease, scarcity, hunger, these would have claimed them. Instead, she imagined they had offered themselves upon a higher altar, where their pain would yield discoveries that would one day end such suffering for millions yet unborn. It was during this season that a newly appointed preacher began his ministry in the village. He was a young man, not long ordained, whose sermons were filled with fire, but whose eyes carried more gentleness than judgment. In his second week, he heard whispers of her actions. He dismissed them at first, for there are always whispers, the strange tales of backwoods towns where grief and gossip twist into something monstrous. Yet it was not long before he too saw the orchard and its fruitless branches, and he felt a chill he could not explain. The preacher visited her home, a gift of bread in hand. She greeted him with quiet dignity, her gray hair gathered in strict knots behind her head. When he spoke of faith and comfort, she countered with science and reason. To him, she said, "Scripture comforts those who are afraid of shadows. But I have looked into the shadows and found not fear, but understanding." He left her house unsettled, unsure whether he had spoken with a devout believer or a mind fully unmoored. As autumn crept across the hills, animals too began to avoid the orchard. Hunters remarked that deer who passed along the ridge would skirt wide arcs to avoid its trees. Stray dogs that wandered into the village lay their ears flat and growled when pressed near its edge. The earth itself seemed restless. Heavy rains washed soil away, revealing shapes too small to be roots, too fragile to be stone. Men who discovered them shuddered, muttering of children buried without a proper rite. They told their wives in hushed voices but dared not accuse openly, for accusation required action. And action meant facing a woman who did not tremble at death, but embraced it as her vocation. Her 6th child, her last, was the one she spared longest. Whether through faltering conviction or tender reluctance, the townsfolk could not say. For months she walked with the girl's hand clasped in hers, a tired but breathing shadow always at her side. Some whispered she had repented. Others whispered she was waiting for the earth to soften enough for one final trial. The latter proved truer. One moonless night, a figure was seen moving through the orchard, shovel in hand, and the small whimper of a child carried unbidden on the wind. By morning, she told neighbors her daughter had succumbed to sudden illness, the same explanation she had breathed before. But they did not believe it. Eyes followed her more openly now. Her name was spoken through clenched teeth, mothers clutching babes to their bosoms, fathers sitting upright through the dark hours with rifles balanced across their knees. When the preacher returned, this time with men of firmer backbone at his side, she did not resist. She invited them into her home as if into a parlor, sat them in chairs she had polished, and laid before them her journals. The men who read those pages later spoke of how their hands shook as they turned them. Ink neat, lines measured, voice absent of remorse. Her words catalogued each child, entry by entry, as though they were livestock rather than flesh she once held to her breast. She marked their weight at death, the sound of their cries, and the time it took for silence to fall. Beside each entry were her own conclusions, phrases such as evidence suggests and further trials required. The preacher's face went pale. Another man retched into his hands. Still, she sat calmly across from them, watching their horror as though it proved the significance of her discoveries. "You are men of faith," she said softly. "But faith blinds. I am a woman of sight, and I have seen further than you dare. I have glimpsed truth beneath the surface, and you mistake courage for madness. They carried the journals away, their eyes downward, unable to meet her calm gaze. Some argued she should be brought before a higher authority in the nearest town. Others urged for swifter judgment, but in their hearts all men knew the chill of impossibility that clung to her. For weeks, the town debated in anxious whispers. Meanwhile, she walked freely through the lanes, purchasing bread, carrying water, always with the same quiet dignity. Mothers pulled their children indoors as she passed. Men spat into the dirt but did not confront her. The orchard lay heavy with silence, its poisoned stillness becoming part of the town's very breath. And though whispers of suspicion pressed hard against her, none dared take action outright. For what creature had she become, that she could lower her own children into the soil without trembling, record their death rattle without breaking, and greet her neighbors afterwards with calm civility? To face her was to stare into a void few were willing to gaze upon. The truth, however, swelled toward its own revelation. For secrets cling only so long before the soil itself gives testimony. If this story is giving you chills, share it with a friend. There are still parts of it yet untold, and together we'll uncover them. The rain came in October like a reckoning. Weeks of downpour softened the ground across the valley, swelled the creek beyond its banks, and carved rivulets through the orchard. The earth, so carefully tamped down upon the small graves, began to sag. Roots gave way, clay collapsed, and the neighbors saw with their own eyes what had been buried beneath. Tiny bones lay half-revealed in the washed-out soil, pale as ivory against the dark mud. A doll's hand, porcelain fractured but still white, protruded beside them, carried loose from the shallow burial. A farmer's boy, wandering too near, returned home pale and silent, clutching that doll until his mother pried it from his fingers. Within hours, the truth pulsed through the town like lightning. There was no more space for whispers. The men gathered at the church, their boots caked with mud, their faces hard. The preacher sat among them, journals of her hand spread open upon the altar. No hymn rang that morning. Instead, voices low and urgent, they debated justice. Some demanded fire, that the orchard and house be burned to ash, and the woman with it. Others hesitated, warning that vengeance outside of law would stain them as much as her crimes. The preacher argued for trial, insisting that even monsters must be weighed before judgment. Few had the stomach for such patience, yet no man denied that action was now inevitable. She seemed unsurprised when they came to her door. She opened it as though expecting their arrival. Her eyes, lined with sleeplessness but steady, moved from one face to another until they came to rest upon the preacher. "You've seen the pages," she said, voice calm as a clerk reciting sums. "Then you know it was not cruelty. It was an inquiry." One of the men spat into the dirt. Another raised his hand as though to strike her, but found himself trembling, unable to cross that threshold. She stood too still as though carved in stone, her presence unnerving even to those convinced of her guilt. They bound her wrists, though she did not resist, and led her through streets where shutters closed quickly at the sight. Some voices called curses from behind walls, others whispered prayers for deliverance. Children pressed their faces against the glass to glimpse the woman whose quiet hand had buried her own flesh. At the church, she was seated before the congregation, the journals placed upon the table as evidence. The preacher began to read, his voice quivering as he forced words into the still air. He read her own entries one after another, descriptions of cries muffled by soil, of small limbs weakening beneath the weight of earth, of silence that followed. The congregation could not look upon her while he spoke. Many wept openly. The sound of mothers sobbing filled the room heavier than thunder. Still, she did not falter. When given the chance to answer, she spoke with the clarity of conviction. "You gather here under faith," she began, her voice firm, unshaken. "But faith blinds you. I saw what you could not. Each life entrusted to me was not wasted, it was invested. They became the proof that death is not simple, not final. In their passing lies knowledge, knowledge that will deliver humankind from its frailty. You call it murder, I call it sacrifice." Her words struck at their hearts like poison, for they carried no sorrow, no apology, only certainty. Some men shouted her down, demanding silence and a rope. Others trembled, not from doubt of her guilt, but from fear of her calm. The preacher silenced them at last. "Monsieur," he called her, "you are charged with the greatest of sins, not only against your children, but against heaven itself. Even Cain's hand, bloody as it was, killed but once. You have made repetition your virtue. Tell us then, what voice whispered these commands if not God's own? Her reply chilled those present so deeply that no record could capture the full silence that followed. It was not a voice, she said softly, but a hunger to see the veil lifted, a hunger for truth. If you fear it, that is your blindness, not mine. The journals were stacked before the congregation, their ink heavy with witness enough to damn her even before confessions fell from her lips. Yet still, procedure demanded deliberation, as though legality could clothe horror in gentility. She remained in the church while the men met once more in hushed tones, their faces drawn with the weight of deciding not if she was guilty, but how she should meet her end. Outside, the orchard sagged further beneath relentless rain. Children's shoes, scraps of fabric, fragments that bore unmistakable innocence surfaced like accusations. No eye could avoid them. No mouth could dismiss them. Even the doubters were silenced. Through those damp and heavy days, she sat confined but unbowed. Visitors came, some to shout hatred, some to spit, while others murmured questions pulsing with morbid curiosity. To each she answered evenly, as if lecturing students. She spoke of soil as guardian, of lungs learning to draw air thin as roots at depth, of moments when she swore she felt faint stirring below her feet. "Another week," she whispered more than once, "and you yourselves would have seen proof. A hand breaking the soil, a breath returning where none should remain. But you have interrupted. You have spoiled the trial." The chilling calm of these words spread dread as surely as any evidence. While neighbors expected tears or hysteria, they found none. Only a woman who believed in her cruelty with the same devotion as others believed in God. As days passed, they planned for her trial before proper magistrates in the nearest town. Yet travel was slow, miles stretched heavy, and whispers grew restless. Mothers pressed upon husbands to end it swiftly. If she waits, they warned, evil will grow stronger. Men walked uneasily around their guns. Flames lingered too long in their eyes when they glanced at her small home. Yet the preacher insisted order must prevail, that even amidst darkness, the law must not give way to mob wrath, but the orchard itself rendered judgment day by day. Rain-soaked graves split. Bones surfaced. Toothless mouths of babes revealed beneath collapsing soil. Each discovery broke down the town's restraint. They could not pass another dawn with horror visible at every step, while the woman responsible sat breathing beneath their watch. By the week's end, it was no longer possible to contain the fury. The congregation gathered not for service, but for judgment. What began in whispers ended in shouts. The preacher stood pale at the altar, scripture open but trembling in his hands. He spoke of patience, trials, and order, yet even his voice cracked beneath the weight of grief that filled the room. For though he pleaded for restraint, his own tears fell heavy upon the pages in his hand. The people roared louder than his words. "Monster!" they cried. "Witch! Murderer!" Some lifted torches were already lit. Others carried ropes. The preacher tried once more, but his calls drowned against the thunder of rage. And in that moment she smiled. The same thin smile neighbors recalled when she had spoken of theories too dark for common ears. To her, their fury was not terror, but vindication. For if humankind trembled at truth, then truth was real enough to fear. Thus the night arrived when justice and vengeance walked side by side. And on that night the orchard saw fire. Night fell upon the settlement heavy as stone. Clouds smothered the moon and left the village in a shadow deeper than ordinary darkness. Lamps flickered in hands clenched too tight, their glow swaying across faces carved by rage and fear. The orchard, silent and sodden from weeks of rain, waited at the edge of their vision like a wound. It began not with shouts but with silence, that heavy, breathless silence that descends before a storm tears open the sky. Men gathered near the church and houses, torches held unlit or tipped low like soldiers awaiting a signal. The preacher, weary-eyed, pressed himself against the doorway, his voice breaking against the wall of fury he could no longer command. "Brothers," he pled, "the Lord's justice is not the same as man's wrath. Let the magistrate decide. Let no sin of ours be added to hers." But the people did not look upon him. They looked toward her house, a black shape at the end of a narrow street, its windows closed, its roofline sharp against the lightless horizon. Inside that house she sat alone, her wrists unbound, though watched, for she had given no resistance. She knew they would come, and she desired it. She believed their outrage was proof that her discoveries mattered more than any law. She sat before her journals, the ink of her final entry not yet dry upon the page. When at last the first torch broke the night, raised on high and burning like judgment itself, the silence shattered. Shouts followed, curses, cries of fury, voices layered upon one another until the street boiled with sound. The preacher's words were drowned in that river of rage. Men, women, even the trembling hands of youth carried light into the darkness, and the heart of the town moved as one toward her door. The orchard loomed beyond the house, each tree stretching crooked limbs like mourners bent over shallow graves. Firelight licked against those branches as the crowd pooled into her yard. Boots churned mud, fists pounded at her wooden door, voices demanded her face. And then, as if the moment was scripted by her own hand, she appeared. Calm, unflinching, framed in the glow of the torches. Her hair gray but neatly bound, her dress black as mourning cloth, her mouth set in that thin, decisive line. She looked upon them and, astonishingly, spoke not of defense, but of pride. "You gather as beasts," she said, her voice firm enough to cut through their noise. "You think you bring judgment, but I have accomplished what no man among you could dream. I buried children and listened as the earth held them. I tasted proof of breath struggling even beneath weight and soil. You do not rage at my crime, you rage because I looked and you turned away. The day will come when the world blesses my name for daring what you would not." The words chilled them more than curses could. To hear her speak of gasps and soil, not with remorse but with reverence, transformed fury into horror. Mothers shrieked and were held back lest they rush at her, claws bared with grief. Men spat openly, their torches raised higher. One voice cried, "Burn her house, burn the orchard. Leave no trace of her madness." Another shouted, "Hang her tonight, lest she rise tomorrow as something worse." Through it all, the preacher raised his hands again, begging for order, for sense, but his voice splintered among the clamor like brittle wood lost in floodwaters. And still she did not cower. When the first torch flew against the wall of her house, catching where rain had not fully soaked the timber, she did not flinch. She stepped down from the doorway and turned her gaze upon the orchard. To her, the fire was not destruction, but illumination. "Bear witness," she cried. "Even in burning, truth remains. You cannot consume discovery, no matter how fierce your flame." The blaze spread quickly. Smoke curled into the sky, carrying with it the scent of aged wood, damp earth, and the faint, sickly sweetness that had long haunted that place. Sparks leapt into branches. Within moments, the orchard itself seethed with fire, each tree lit as if the graves below demanded purification at last. The crowd watched, half with satisfaction, half with fear of what they had done. Their cries slowed, their rage flickering uncertain between triumph and dread. The orchard, once silent, now howled as fire cracked through branches. And in that terrible light, shadows writhed across the ground. Shadows shaped not wholly of flame, not wholly of branch, but somehow of the children whose bones had waited in that soil. Some swore they saw hands pressing upward through dirt. Others saw nothing but smoke. Yet none ever forgot the way the air seemed to echo with thin cries, indistinguishable from the sound of wood splitting as it burned. They seized her then, not in haste, but in grim finality. Rope was brought, coarse and heavy, meant for labor of field and barn, now turned to instrument of justice. She did not resist. Her lips moved faintly as though still recording some observation even in the final hour. Her gaze never softened, her voice never pleaded. "Do you not see?" she murmured as the rope tightened upon her wrists. "This is the cost of knowledge. You may kill me, but you cannot kill the question I dared to ask. How firm is the boundary between breath and silence? How heavy is the soil between them?" And as they dragged her beneath the nearest tree, half engulfed already in flame, she looked upon the crowd with something like triumph. For though she faced death, she believed she had already carved her name into the marrow of history. The preacher refused to watch. He turned his face to the ground, tears carving through soot upon his cheeks. The others, their hatred and trembling courage mingled, pulled the rope high until her feet no longer pressed earth. Her body swung against branches that cracked with fire, her shadow cast enormous against the blaze. The orchard groaned in its burning, and in that moment, justice and terror were twin flames that rose together into the night. They let her hang until silence fell heavy and only embers remained where the soil once kept its secrets. When at last rope was cut, and her figure dropped lifeless into mud, no prayer was said above her. They buried her in ground far from orchard, far from children, buried her with no stone, no name, no rite. The orchard burned 3 nights before rain quenched the last coals. When the smoke cleared and the sun returned, only blackened trunks remained, their roots knotted in soil that would never again be tilled nor planted. And in the ashes, bones of children were found scattered, gnawed clean by fire but unmistakable. Proof enough, though none had doubted. The townsfolk did not speak easily of that week. Men who had carried rope spoke little, ashamed of their anger and yet grateful for its result. Women wept in silence. Mothers rocked babes in arms too tightly, as if the soil itself waited to swallow breath. The preacher, broken in spirit, left before winter. His sermons, once filled with fire, could no longer find words enough to banish darkness. He walked eastward and was never heard of again. The house was razed to foundation and the land left untended. Travelers who passed by decades later spoke of a field barren as stone, where no bird perched and no crop took hold. Her journals, stained by smoke yet preserved by trembling hands, were sealed in the archives of county. Few dared read beyond the first lines. Fewer still admitted aloud what fascination lingered after those pages closed. For though she hanged, though flame consumed her orchard, her words endured. And in every generation there are those reckless enough and hungry enough to wonder if the widow's science was madness alone, or if she glimpsed something unspoken in the soil. In the months after her death, the town carried itself as though bruised by invisible hands. No feast was held, no dance in the schoolhouse, no gathering in the church save for whispered prayers too hushed to echo. The community had won its grim victory, but the flavor of it was bitter, leaving their tongues dry with regret. The orchard, now nothing more than blackened husks of apple trees, stood like a skeleton at the edge of town. By day, children dared to creep near, taunted by curiosity, only to run shrieking when the wind stirred ash into ghostly whirls. By night, no soul went near it, for the cries still seemed to carry through the burned branches. Some claimed they heard scratching beneath the soil, faint as rats, restless as stirrings of the damned. Whether trick of memory or lingering truth, it was enough to keep the people away. The graves, shallow and half-consumed by fire, were never fully exhumed. The town agreed quietly, almost unanimously, that the earth had claimed its debt and should remain closed forever. It was better to turn eyes aside, to let those remains dissolve into dirt. And so the field was left untended, weeds rising wild and thorned, cloaking the memory under a crown of nettles. Still, travelers noted that even weeds bore no blossoms there. Her house, razed and stripped of furniture, left only a stone chimney rising alone, blackened with smoke. Over the years, the stones toppled one by one, as if refusing to stand sentinel over a crime that even death had not absolved. The hearthstone remained longest, moss threading through its cracks, as though nature itself tried to bind the wound. Yet tales have a way of crawling out of soot and silence. The journals she kept, the same volumes read aloud at her trial, were preserved by county authorities, though locked in a vault sealed to public eyes. Inside them, steadied words still documented her children, not as sons or daughters, but as subjects, as theories brought to flesh. Those few who dared even glance upon the volumes recoiled as though burned, yet each time the scholars and clerks carried them closed again to their vault, something lingered. The fear and the fascination. A legend took root among nearby settlements. They whispered of the mother of ashes, the widow who buried her children alive and called their suffering discovery. She became both a cautionary tale and a monster, a shadow invoked to frighten restless children at night. "Hush," mothers said to little ones who cried too loudly. "Hush, lest the mother of ashes hear and come for you." The name spread beyond the valley, seeping into other counties, and then across the years until it became less a history than a warning. For those who had known her in life, however, legend was not needed. Memory sufficed. Women washed floors at dusk and remembered her gaze at the market, the way she spoke not of warmth but of trials. Men swung hammers and remembered the sight of small bones revealed by rainwater, pale as a winter moon. The preacher never returned, but he wrote letters before his disappearance. Letters hinting that he believed she was not merely mad, but guided by something darker, a hunger not wholly her own. These words festered in church records until they too became part of her story. The town itself dwindled. Families left, unwilling to raise their children where laughter had once been buried. The creek changed course decades later, washing away what had been the orchard's edge, carrying with it soil and bones and memory alike. By then, only a handful of structures remained. The town, once small but hopeful, dissolved into a place travelers passed through but did not stay, yet the story refused to fade. In 1902, nearly 35 years after the hanging, a construction crew clearing ground in 2 counties east uncovered something unexpected. A buried chest of oak, sealed tight, its lock rusted but intact. Inside were notebooks, unmistakably hers, pages filled with sketches of anatomy, crude experiments, and maps pointing not only to the orchard, but to 2 other sites across the frontier. The pages suggested that what she had done in that valley was neither beginning nor end, but a continuation of work already attempted elsewhere. The find was hushed quickly, yet a handful of scholars copied sections in secret before the books vanished into private collections. In these pages, she described her children not as an exception, but as the most faithful subjects she could employ, for they carried her blood and would not betray the experiment's nuance. She reasoned that love and blood were the very bonds that made their sacrifice most instructive, a sentiment so cold, yet written with such orderly calm, that it shamed even hardened men who later dared repeat it. Her legacy corrupted more than one mind. At least 2 figures in early 20th century medicine are rumored to have studied her fragments in search of physiological insight. One young doctor, fired with ambition, spoke openly about having glimpsed the principle of suspended life, that moment when the body lives, breath clings, but no longer as an ordinary span. He died quietly in obscurity, disgraced, but his words suggest that fascination endures like an infection, and so warnings persisted. Farmers who wandered too close to the burned ground in later decades carried home dreams that twisted their sleep, leaving them restless and uneasy. They awoke trembling, murmuring, as children called faintly from beneath the floorboards of their farmhouses. Hunters rode wide circles to avoid the orchard site, too troubled by sudden chill or snapping twigs underfoot. The clearest sign that her presence lingered came one spring morning, when heavy rains uncovered again what seemed to be part of the iron nail she had used to mark her ledgers. Though rust had corroded much of it, townsfolk whispered that it gleamed faintly when moonlight struck, as though preserving its task as faithfully as the ink it once steadied. All the while, generations debated, was she a true monster, or a creature driven by grief-turned-scientist? Was her hand controlled by obsession alone, or did she brush against some hidden threshold unknown to the rest of humankind? Some preachers in neighboring towns declared she was proof of Satan's cunning, dressing ambition as study. Others argued her case warned of reason unchained from compassion, how science without heart becomes terror. Still, she could not be erased. Each retelling gave her more life than perhaps truth deserved. Each whisper ensured her tragedy would echo further. The orchard never grew again. The soil hardened into barren clay, bearing only thorns and deadfall. Birds would not sing there, and dogs would not pass. To this day, maps mark the location with no name, only a blank field, although locals are aware of it and steer clear of it. Some say even snow falls thinner upon that patch, as though heaven itself avoids cloaking it. At night, if one stands near the field, the air grows restless. The ground seems to shift faintly, though no tremor is felt elsewhere. And some claim that if you listen long enough, under the sob of wind through grassless ground, you may hear the shallow, suffocated cries of those who should have grown tall but never did. It was a wound to one valley, yet it carried through history like a stain on cloth never fully washed away. Every age retold it quietly, generation to generation, never with complete accuracy, but always with the same truth. A mother chose curiosity over children, calculation over love, and in doing so, became something the world remembers even when her name is forgotten. And so the orchard lies silent, but never empty. Empty ground holds weight heavier than stone, and silence often screams. Her death might have closed the chapter of one lonely, afflicted mother, yet the story did not stay buried. Instead, it drifted like smoke across counties, across hills, whispered by travelers at firelight, woven into sermons as a warning, and muttered by mothers trying to hush sharp-tongued children. And from these whispers came not silence, but echoes. By the turn of the century, more than 30 years after her hanging, the remnants of her journals began to circulate among collectors of the macabre. County officials had tried to secure them, to lock away her ink-stained ledgers, lest darker minds seek them. Yet copies leaked, fragments were copied, and fascination spread among physicians hungry for novelty. Her words were unemotional, precise, devoid of tenderness, and yet magnetic in their cadence. They read less like confession than instruction, an instruction book written in the blood of her own kin. It was into these fragments that certain men delved. In 1911, records show a lecturer at an obscure medical college delivered a speech on what he called the edge of respiration, the theory that air could be cut off and reapplied without breaking the continuity of life, so long as precise variables of time and pressure were observed. Listeners recalled years later the uncanny similarity between his terms and those scratched by her hand in journals that had long been hidden. The lecturer disappeared months later after rumors of an experiment gone wrong, though whether his fate was a coincidence or a consequence, no one could prove. Outsiders, too, came in search of the orchard. Many decades after its burning, enough remained to stir curiosity. Travelers from distant towns asked directions while pretending they sought pasture land or timber, but locals knew that look in the eye, the look of men who wanted to walk at the edge of shadow. Some were students, drawn by morbid fascination. Others were men of science, eager to glimpse even ruin in which whispers of forbidden discovery lingered. But villagers rarely guided them. Instead, they waved vaguely toward the valley, letting trespassers find their own unease among brambles and desolation. Letters survive from men who crossed that field. Unearthed among estates when they died, the correspondence carried tremors that no ordinary soil should cause. One wrote, "The ground feels hollow, every step as though the earth resents me for pressing it." Another wrote, "Ash marks still smear the soil, though rain should have washed them long ago." And in my ears I think I heard laughter, small and delicate, though the field was empty. Not all returned unscathed. Stories tell of 3 youths in 1924 who dared sleep upon that acre, testing one another's courage. By dawn only 2 rose. The third was found hours later, not dead, not injured, but wide-eyed, unable to speak more than broken phrases. His mind never healed. He simply rocked, repeating the word soil until his final days. It was not only superstitious imagination that fed the tale. Traces seemed to conspire against forgetting. Farmers working miles away reported their livestock grew restless when driven past that valley. Horses shied, eyes rolling, refusing to cross its line of sight. Birds migrating south wheeled suddenly above, dividing to opposite flanks as if some invisible column rose from its center. Even weeds failed to grow in proper springtime, leaving the earth gray and bare, while fields on every side grew green. The widow's journals instructed none directly to repeat her crime, yet their tone suggested continuity of thought. She wrote often as though addressing posterity, as though scrawling in margins for an audience not yet born but anticipated. One entry read, "Others will come, stronger than these trembling men who hanged me. They will see that fear disguises proof. Bury deep, observe long, and the boundary shall weaken." Dark words that took on new weight as seekers appeared at the site. By the late 1930s, her story entered broader folklore. Traveling shows repeated it under gaslight tents, part ghost story, part lecture, convincing paying crowds that science could turn to horror if the heart was left behind. The Widow of Ashes, they called her, painting her as both sorceress and surgeon. Audiences wept and shivered, and yet left with a strange spark of curiosity. Was the tale invention or history gone rotten? The orators rarely supplied proof, but the questions lingered long enough to etch the tale deeper into memory. World wars came and went. Empires swayed and fell. Modern science uncovered truths greater than she could have dreamed. Yet in forgotten corners, men still spoke her name. Some dismissed it as superstition, others treated it as a parable against ambition. Yet for a certain few, less innocent, her writings offered a glimpse of rebellion against the limits of flesh and death itself. These few sought her words the way the desperate seek relics. They paid in gold and secrecy to collectors willing to pass along charred notebooks and yellowed copies. And each time one changed hands, her voice found another ear willing to listen. A voice that had once murmured lullabies turned instead to instruct experimenters. One line read, "They struggled 3 minutes before silence. At 3 minutes, one may find revival. at 4 rhythm breaks, at 5 hopeless, matter-of-fact, bone-cold, yet irresistible to minds eager for thresholds, and so they lingered. Doctors, philosophers, even devotees of darker traditions all placed the widow Sinclair, as the Forgotten Land called her, not merely among criminals, but among those who wrote unwilling scripture. A scripture penned not in pursuit of God, but curiosity at odds with humanity. For the valleys that birthed her, however, legend sufficed. The orchard decreased to only memory, its burned soil overtaken by grassless clumps and patches where even moss refused shade. Locals told their youth to avoid it, yet as always, youth crept near in defiance. They returned pale, silent, or boastful, each with tales eager to outdo the last. Shadows of children glimpsed crouching in ash. The sound of shovels against dirt when no hands wielded them. Laughter broken midway to sobbing, carried on a wind that did not match the night. More remarkable still were reports from families who moved too close to the site. Babies, they said, cried with peculiar echo in those homes, cries softer than their throats allowed, as if some other infant murmured along. Mothers fled, unable to endure the doubling voice. Houses were abandoned, barns left to rot, until distance placed again between embers of that field and those desperate enough to live near it. Her name became both prayer and curse, invoked at hushed meetings and coffee tables, repeated in journals of historians half reluctant, half compelled. Each retelling changed slightly, yet the core remained. A mother turned scientist of the dead, humanity stunned not simply by the violence of loss, but by her chilling calm in naming lost discovery. Perhaps the truest legacy of her work was not her experiment itself, nor even the ashes of her orchard, but doubt, the seed she planted in unguarded minds. Doubt whether the limit between life and death, so trusted by priest and doctor alike, could be altered. Doubt whether horror was merely crime, or whether crime sometimes clawed open truths too vile to endure. And so her story enters every ear differently. For some it is warning, for others temptation, for all unease, and unease is enough to keep the widow alive, not in body but in legend, lurking, whispering, waiting for the next curious eye willing to peer through soil and ask the question she never ceased asking. Time turns history to dust, yet some dust settles heavier than stone. By the middle of the 20th century, the widow's name had nearly dissolved from court records and county books, but her legend grew larger than the documents ever could. In roadside taverns, fishermen swapped her story over cider. In schoolhouses, when lamps flickered, teachers recited her tale to hush unruly children. And around winter hearths, when wind moaned through chinks in walls, whole families listened to her memory as both threat and fireside entertainment. What was once fact became layered with invention. Some told her she buried not 6 but 12 children. Others swore she had never borne children at all, that she stole them from neighbors under the cover of a storm, and disguised her theft as fever and death. Still others wove a darker thread, that she did not bury the little ones alone, but with books clutched to their chests, sealing them to the soil as both sacrifice and experiment. Accuracy no longer mattered. Sensation held reign, and still, beneath the embellishment, the essential horror remained unchanged. A mother, entrusted with life, traded love for curiosity. She smothered tenderness and, in its place, took up what she called science. Whether they numbered 6 or a dozen, whether related by blood or theft, the image refused to fade, children lowered beneath earth by hands that once should have soothed them. Generations wore on. Automobiles hummed where wagons once creaked, electric power coursed where candles had sputtered. Yet even amid modern lamps and radios, her story found a new voice. Ghost hunters drove the old roads to the orchard's ruins, snapping photographs of light streaks they swore were spirits. Psychics declared the ground unclean, claiming to hear faint giggles turned gurgling from beneath charred roots. Thrill-seekers trespassed and carved initials into the last blackened stumps, daring one another to remain until midnight. Few did. Those who lingered described the same sensation. The orchard, they said, breathed. Soil shifted ever so slightly beneath boots, as if turning in sleep. Wind wound strange through branches that bore no leaves, carrying not a whistle but a sigh. And always, always, the faint hawthorn-sweet smell on the air, even when no blossom bloomed. That smell, which neighbors had half a century earlier remembered lingering on clothing, was sticky and accusatory. Storytellers abroad turned her into something more myth than woman. Folklorists in New England spoke of her as a witch. Appalachia wove tunes of her crime into ballads, sung by fiddlers whose voices cracked as though afraid to carry her name too loudly. Even scholars on far shores collected the fragments, folding her tale among the grotesqueries of human obsession. For each teller adjusted the angle. Some warned parents never to neglect the bonds of love, lest darkness replace it. Others cast her as evidence that curiosity without mercy corrodes into atrocity. And some, lowest of all, whispered not warning but admiration, claiming her hands touched a threshold others feared to near. These were the few who traveled still, decades later, to scratch away at soil with their own shovels, searching not for crops but for hints of whatever she promised lay beneath. Time doctored her image too. In illustrations and crude sketches found in pulp magazines of the 1920s and 30s, she was drawn not with honest likeness, but as a gaunt phantom, hair wild, eyes hollow. In others, she appears cloaked, holding a lantern while small fingers claw from the earth around her. Painters, photographers, and carnival artists took liberty with her, turning her calm and human cruelty into something theatrically monstrous. Yet those who had known her in life insisted that was not the truth. She was not gaunt, not raving, not screaming at the sky. She was ordinary in every outward aspect. The butcher's wife from 2 towns over would have looked the same. The horror was not in her appearance, but in her calm. The greatest villainy was that she looked like anyone else. That is what unnerved generations most. She was not the demon mothers invoked to keep children in bed, though she became one in the story. She was not sharp-fanged or shadow-skinned. She was flesh like yours, like mine. She nodded to the neighbors at the market, purchased flour, and smiled faintly when offered greetings. And behind that smile, she planned the burials of her children. Such is a terror no sketch or song can equal. By the 1960s, when modern historians scoured archives, they sought to separate fact from rumor. They traced property deeds, court records, and burial registries. They interviewed ragged descendants of settlers who once lived in the town. The official history confirmed only fragments. An orchard burnt in 1869, a widow executed without a marker, journals once seized, later locked away. But no gravestones bore the children's names. It was as if their memory had been swallowed into the soil along with their breath. Yet folklore resists erasure. In lecture halls, professors of anthropology remarked on her as an example of how history shades into a ghost story. Students scribbled notes, half horror, half amused, yet unable to forget. Religious writers claimed her act proved that when the heart turns away from God, science itself may become an idol of blood. Popular magazines, always hungry for nightmares, printed her tale beside vampire stories and werewolf tales, scarcely caring she had once been flesh and blood. The widow no longer belonged to time or fact. She belonged to fear, and fear is durable currency. Fear buys attention, it buys memory, it buys immortality of its own. Long after bones erode, fear lingers in the air. Travelers today still speak of oddness in the vicinity of the site. A rural highway now cuts not far from where the orchard lay. Motorists report engines stalling without cause. Some claim their children wake screaming in back seats as they pass, clawing at windows, though nothing can be seen outside. Others glimpse, for a flicker behind the tree line, small pale faces pressed at soil level, watching until the car moves on. Perhaps all imagination. Perhaps nothing. But stories demand not certainty to survive. They demand only retelling, and retelling has never ceased. The widow is no longer only Martha Sinclair, flesh-born, born to prayer and duty, yet turned to dread. She has become an archetype. She is every warning mother gives, every story children whisper beneath quilts. She is what lingers when science divorces conscience, what remains when inquiry throws away love, and that is her immortality. Not proof unearthed, nor journal examined, nor charred stump in a barren field. Her immortality is remembrance. Shadows keep her alive. Words keep her awake. And people such as us, leaning close to this story, listening across more than a century, are the proof that she succeeded, not in science, but in echo. The widow's tale did not vanish with her rope, nor with her burning orchard. It did what all true horrors do. It slipped quietly into the bloodstream of the land and hid there, waiting to stir when memory weakened. Each retelling, whether by preacher, schoolteacher, or wanderer, became not only history, but inheritance. Generations shifted, but the soil remained. Fields greened around the barren patch. Families rebuilt homes along nearby ridges, yet the orchard's mark endured like scar tissue in the earth. Farmers plowing too near claimed their oxen balked and turned aside, refusing no matter whip or prod to drag iron across that cursed boundary. Hikers in later years avoided the place altogether, speaking of unease that dropped upon them like fog. By day it was silent. By night it was not even silent, it lived with whispers. Some say her punishment cleansed nothing, that though she died by fire and hanging, the ground itself had absorbed her experiments, rooting them into clay and stone. The cries of children, some whispered, had soaked into the roots and waited beneath, restless as seeds of thorn that could never sprout. Locals passed down instructions to their own children. Avoid the orchard. Never speak her name after sunset. If you hear a faint voice calling in the dark, do not under any mercy answer. For those who answered, even in jest, risked losing something in return. In 1987, 2 teenagers dared each other to call her name at midnight upon the ruins. They returned screaming, clawing at their clothes, repeating that the ground itself had breathed. No harm touched them after, but madness sat in their eyes for weeks. One left for the city soon after. The other never strayed further than his family's farmhouse again, claiming he heard scratching beneath his floorboards every night until his passing. In this way, her story outgrew history entirely. It became myth, curse, haunting. People feared her not as a murderer only, but as something worse. Something that remained in the earth itself, waiting for those who sought answers too dangerous to ask. And yet, there are always those who chase the forbidden. Amateur historians request her documents under false pretenses. Occultists whisper that she discovered the key to preserving breath beyond the body. True crime collectors bid fortunes for a fragment of her letters, charred though they are. Such seekers never cease. They hunger for more than truth. They hunger to step where she stepped, not caring that her path descends into rot. And perhaps she knew all along. Perhaps that was her truest experiment, not merely to bury children beneath soil, but to bury herself in memory, to test whether she could rise again not in flesh but in thought. And she did. Each generation exhumes her not with shovels but with words, lifting her back from earth by curiosity alone. She is alive here, alive in this telling, alive in your listening. That, more than any false science, secures her immortality. But immortality carries a price. The price is unease, the knowledge that the one place all mothers should embody love, she replaced with calculation. The hearth became a laboratory. The crib became a ledger. The orchard became a pit of trials. And the terrible truth branded upon those who hear her story is that such a conversion is not the work of demons or devils. It is the work of a person, flesh and bone, face ordinary, hands capable. That ordinariness is what haunts most deeply. She was never monstrous in appearance. She was a widow, a woman marked by loss, dressed in black, walking home from market. She looked to any passerby like countless others across the frontier. Yet in her mind lived the justification of atrocity. That is the sharpest fear, that monsters may walk beside us bearing human faces. In the quiet hours after midnight, when winds press against windows and shadows lean long across the floor, imagine her ledger pages turning. Imagine the sound of pen against paper, steady, unhurried, each child carefully measured, marked, silenced. And then imagine that she cataloged not only them but us, that every listener who lends ear to this tale becomes in some way another subject, another figure in her grand experiment upon memory. You are proof, after all, that she remains. Would you have listened so long if some fragment of you too did not hunger to stare across the veil with her? That is the question she leaves in her wake. Not whether she was evil, history has judged that. Not whether her science was true, her orchard is ash, her body dust. The lingering question is whether we, in retelling her tale, partake in the very hunger that brazened her hands. She sought knowledge without mercy. We seek memory without rest. And so she rises again each time her name is spoken. The orchard is gone. The house collapsed. The journals locked beyond reach. Yet the tale endures. And if by chance you wander too near where the soil still refuses wheat, listen, only do not listen too long, for beneath that soil the earth remembers. It breathes with sighs that were once cries. And though she swung from firelit tree more than a century ago, some claim that if you press your ear to the ground even now, you may hear her voice, calm as ever, whispering in steady tones, further trials required, and that whisper may follow you home. If you have walked with us this far through the shadows of her story, carry this lesson as warning. Curiosity unbound from compassion will turn hearth to grave and cradle to pit, and the boundaries of life and death are not ours to command. The widow who buried her children alive did so not with fangs or claws, but with conviction, and conviction is a tool more terrible than blade. If this story has taken hold of you, do not let it breathe alone. Share it so others may know, speak it so the soil grows lighter, and remember, the more we speak her memory, the longer her hunger is fed. Now, if you wish to walk deeper into forgotten corridors of history, where shadows cling and truths bite harder than fiction, subscribe to this channel. Like this tale if it has chilled your blood, and comment below your thoughts. Do you believe her story is finished? Or does it still breathe in places unseen? The decision is yours. The orchard may be ash, yet its silence still waits beneath our feet.